my daughter handed me my late wife's recipe box after keeping it through months of renovating her kitchen. Everything looked exactly the way I remembered. The worn wooden lid, the tiny brass latch, the faint scent of cinnamon that somehow never disappeared. Then I reached my wife's famous peach cobbler recipe. The ingredients were perfect. The handwriting wasn't. Someone had carefully rewritten the most treasured recipe in our family, and I suddenly realized they weren't trying to change dessert. They were trying to hide a story. If you've ever recognized someone you loved by the smallest details, stay with me for a little while. For several minutes, I simply sat at the dining room table staring at the recipe card. Margaret's handwriting had always leaned gently to the right. Every capital letter curled the same way. Every measurement carried tiny notes she claimed were more important than the ingredients themselves. The rewritten card copied every ingredient perfectly: flour, fresh peaches, butter, brown sugar, cinnamon. Nothing had changed, except the person holding the pen. During 28 years serving as a Marine Corps supply chief, I learned something that prevented more inventory mistakes than any checklist ever printed. When the quantities remained identical, but the labels changed, someone usually wanted people to notice the contents instead of the history. Sarah watched me quietly from across the kitchen. I had to rewrite a few of them. The originals were fading, technically possible, emotionally incomplete. She never said why she chose that recipe first. She simply smiled and began unpacking the last of the kitchen boxes. I nodded. I understand. Visible relief crossed her face. She believed I had accepted the explanation. That evening, I unlocked the old cedar cabinet where Margaret kept everything connected to church dinners. Community cookbooks, county fair ribbons, harvest supper menus, recipe notebooks tied with faded blue ribbon. Near the bottom rested a thin folder labeled, in Margaret's careful handwriting, Harvest Dinners. Inside lay copies of church supper menus dating back almost 20 years. Beside each dessert list, Margaret had written tiny handwritten initials. Not ingredient changes, not serving counts, just initials. The rewritten peach cobbler card contained none of them, another carefully chosen omission. The following morning, I unfolded the original recipe card Sarah had placed beneath the rewritten copy. Its edges had become fragile. Grease stains covered one corner. The faded pencil notes remained barely visible beneath the kitchen light. For the first time since opening the recipe box, I stopped wondering whether Sarah had simply been protecting an old family recipe from disappearing. Instead, I began wondering why someone had carefully preserved every ingredient, while quietly erasing the only handwritten notes my wife had ever added herself. I placed the original peach cobbler recipe back beneath the rewritten card without mentioning the missing initials to Sarah. Some questions deserved evidence before they deserved emotion. During 28 years serving as a Marine Corps supply chief, I learned another lesson that rarely failed. When one inventory record contradicted another, the earlier documentation usually explained why. The following afternoon, Sarah stopped by, carrying a basket of fresh peaches from the local farmer's market. They looked like Mom would have bought them. They do. For several quiet minutes, we talked about ordinary things: her students, the church garden, the coming harvest dinner. Finally, she glanced toward the recipe box resting on the kitchen table. "You've been looking through everything." "I have." "I'm glad." technically honest, emotionally incomplete. She never asked whether I noticed the rewritten recipe. She simply waited. Instead of pressing her, I smiled. "I'm grateful you protected the cards." Visible relief crossed her face. She believed I had accepted her explanation. After she left, I reopened the folder marked Harvest Dinners. Inside rested church supper menus dating back almost 20 years. Margaret had always written tiny initials beside the desserts she prepared. The initials changed every year. The recipes never did. Near the back of the folder, I found another document tucked between two menu pages, a community cookbook committee worksheet. Every contributor's recipe appeared exactly as published, except Margaret's peach cobbler. Beside her recipe, someone had handwritten original notes retained separately. Retained, not removed, not discarded. Another carefully chosen phrase. The following morning, I visited the county fair office. Margaret entered the peach cobbler competition almost every autumn, never because she wanted ribbons, but because she loved talking with neighbors afterward. The records clerk recognized her name immediately. "We still keep her entry cards." She returned carrying a slim archive folder. Every fair entry matched the recipe in my hands. The ingredients never changed. The measurements never changed. But each original entry carried the same tiny, handwritten initials I had seen in Margaret's Harvest Dinner folders. The printed cookbook version did not. Driving home, my confidence in Sarah's explanation quietly began to fade. The rewritten recipe wasn't preserving an old family tradition. It was preserving the version everyone else had always seen. That evening, I opened another cedar box Margaret kept beside her recipe journals. Most contained handwritten hospitality notes. Near the bottom rested 3 letters from Grace Holloway, the church librarian. Each letter ended with the same handwritten sentence. "The names remain safely protected." Names, not recipes, not ingredients, another carefully chosen word. For the first time since Sarah returned the recipe box, I stopped wondering who had rewritten my wife's famous peach cobbler recipe. Instead, I began wondering whose names those tiny handwritten initials had quietly protected for all those years, and why Grace Holloway seemed to know the answer before anyone else. For the next several days, I behaved exactly the way Sarah expected. I stopped mentioning the rewritten recipe. I thanked her for protecting the old cards. I even told her I was grateful someone had taken the time to preserve her mother's handwriting as best they could. She smiled with visible relief, not because the mystery had disappeared, because she believed I had stopped following it. During 28 years serving as a Marine Corps supply chief, I learned another lesson that quietly solved more inventory problems than any inspection ever could. The moment people believed you had stopped checking the records, they stopped protecting the missing pages. That became my strategy. On Tuesday morning, I visited the church library. Grace Holloway greeted me before I reached the archive room. I wondered how long it would take. How long? Before the recipe brought you here? Not if, when. Without another word, she unlocked a narrow cabinet tucked behind the community cookbook shelves. Unlike the public church archives, these shelves held hospitality journals, handwritten supper rosters, pantry records, and volunteer notebooks reaching back more than 30 years. Grace carefully removed one slim binder, Across the cover appeared 4 simple words: Harvest Hospitality Journal. Not recipes, not cooking, hospitality. The wording quietly settled into my thoughts. Inside rested handwritten meal records from nearly every harvest dinner Margaret had helped organize. Beside her peach cobbler entry, one familiar notation appeared again and again. Family remembered, remembered, not served, not donated. Another carefully chosen phrase. I looked toward Grace. What family? She hesitated. The journals answer that. Technically honest, emotionally unfinished. Instead of pressing her further, I quietly turned another page. Folded inside rested an old photograph. Margaret stood beside several women in the church kitchen, wrapping peach cobblers in plain brown paper. No ribbons, no church labels, no announcement board. The back of the photograph carried only one handwritten sentence: no table should be empty tonight. For the first time since Sarah returned the recipe box, my first conclusion quietly collapsed. The peach cobbler recipe had never existed simply to preserve a family dessert. Driving home, another realization settled into my thoughts. If Margaret repeatedly marked certain families as remembered, then the missing initials beside the recipe probably had nothing to do with ingredients at all. That afternoon, I opened another cedar box I had never fully explored after Margaret passed away. Between several church newsletters rested a small cloth-covered notebook. Not a recipe journal, not a shopping list, a hospitality ledger. Across the inside cover, Margaret had written only 6 words. Open after the recipe returns home, not after my death, not after the harvest dinner, after the recipe returns home. For several long moments, I simply held the notebook without opening it. Then, another folded document slipped onto the table. A volunteer pantry access card. Its issue date matched every harvest dinner listed inside Grace's hospitality journal. The rewritten peach cobbler recipe was no longer leading me toward a family misunderstanding. It was quietly leading me toward a ministry my wife had apparently protected through one simple recipe card. One she never intended anyone to fully understand until the right time finally arrived. I carried Margaret's hospitality ledger home without opening it. Some promises deserved the same patience as the people who had quietly protected them. For years, I believed the family recipe box represented nothing more than our happiest meals together. Now I wasn't certain those recipe cards had ever existed simply to teach someone how to cook. During 28 years serving as a Marine Corps supply chief, I learned another lesson that quietly prevented more logistical failures than any inventory checklist. The most valuable record was rarely the recipe itself. It was the system quietly connecting every record around it. That evening I spread every clue across my dining room table. The rewritten peach cobbler recipe, the original grease-stained recipe card, the harvest dinner menus, the county fair entries, Grace's letters. The unopened hospitality ledger rested quietly in the center. Every document repeated the same idea: families, not food. The following morning, I finally opened Margaret's ledger. Inside rested only one handwritten page. No shopping lists, no recipes. Only one sentence written in her familiar blue ink. If the recipe ever comes home, don't ask who copied it. Ask whose table it quietly filled. I read the sentence twice, then a third time. The mystery quietly changed. The rewritten recipe had never existed to preserve a dessert. It had existed to protect someone. Later that morning, Grace Holloway invited me back to the church. She wasn't waiting inside the library. She stood inside the fellowship hall where volunteers were preparing displays for the upcoming harvest dinner. Long tables filled the room. Community cookbooks, old photographs, county fair ribbons, church anniversary displays. "I think you're finally ready." Grace carefully unfolded one presentation board resting against the stage. Across its center stretched a map of our county. Small pins connected the church, the food pantry, the elementary school, the senior center, and more than a dozen family homes. Every route ended beside one handwritten symbol, a peach. "It was never just a recipe," Grace said softly. "It became the quiet way your wife organized hospitality. Technically complete, emotionally unfinished." She pointed toward one faded notation written years earlier beside Margaret's name. Hospitality Circle Coordinator. Coordinator, not baker, not volunteer. Another carefully chosen title. Grace quietly explained that whenever a family quietly entered financial hardship, Margaret never wanted them identified publicly through church assistance. Instead, one extra peach cobbler appeared at every harvest dinner. After the meal ended, volunteers simply delivered leftovers to families Margaret had discreetly marked with handwritten initials. No one accepted charity. Everyone simply believed the church had baked too much dessert. Driving home, every earlier conclusion quietly collapsed. The peach cobbler recipe had never been feeding crowds. It had quietly protected dignity. That afternoon, I attended a harvest dinner planning meeting. Harold Benson reviewed the anniversary exhibits. One recommendation immediately caught my attention: undocumented hospitality traditions excluded from permanent display. Margaret's quiet ministry would disappear beneath one perfectly reasonable historical decision. I asked no questions. Harold noticed me and smiled. "I'm glad you came. I wanted to understand. I think you'll appreciate a simpler presentation." He believed I had accepted the rewritten recipe as nothing more than a family keepsake. Strategic surrender quietly lowered every remaining defense around him. As volunteers packed away display materials, one archive folder slipped onto the floor. Several pages scattered across the fellowship hall. Most contained exhibit layouts. One carried a heading I had never seen before: Hospitality Legacy Review. Across the bottom, 3 words had been stamped in blue ink: supporting authorization required. Required. Not recommended. Not optional. For the first time since Sarah returned the recipe box, I understood the real deadline. The harvest dinner wasn't simply celebrating another church tradition. It would determine whether Margaret's quiet ministry of feeding forgotten families became part of our church's permanent history, or quietly disappeared beneath one perfectly reasonable administrative decision. 5 days remained before the church harvest dinner. 5 days before decades of quiet hospitality would either become part of our church's permanent history or quietly disappear beneath one ordinary administrative decision. I spread every document across my dining room table: the rewritten peach cobbler recipe, the original grease-stained recipe card, the harvest dinner menus, the county fair records, Grace's hospitality journal, the hospitality legacy review. Every page quietly pointed toward the same conclusion. One supporting authorization still remained missing. During 28 years serving as a Marine Corps supply chief, I learned another lesson that prevented more failed audits than replacing missing inventory ever could. When every document pointed toward one missing authorization, that authorization usually carried the only signature everyone still needed. The following morning, Grace Holloway arrived carrying a weathered blue archive box. "I've been protecting this for years." "You promised Margaret." "I promised everyone," she quietly helped. Inside rested decades of handwritten hospitality journals, church pantry records, volunteer meal schedules, letters from families who never knew exactly who had left warm dinners on their porches during difficult seasons. Then, one sealed envelope immediately caught my attention. Across the front, Margaret had written, "Open only if the hospitality circle is questioned. Not after my death. Not after the harvest dinner. After the ministry itself is challenged." Grace quietly lowered her eyes. "I prayed no one would ever need this." Inside rested only one small archive reference card, not the missing authorization, just an archive number. Church Heritage File C18. Driving directly to the church archives, I located File C18 exactly where the catalog indicated. Its shelves contained pantry ministry reports, harvest dinner planning files, hospitality correspondence, cookbook committee records, and volunteer documentation reaching back almost 30 years. The divider marked C18 stood completely empty. The file had been removed, not recently, years earlier. For the first time since Sarah returned the recipe box, disappointment settled more heavily than curiosity. Without the supporting authorization, Margaret's quiet ministry appeared incomplete. That afternoon, I quietly attended another harvest dinner planning meeting. Harold Benson greeted me warmly. "I'm glad you came. I wanted to understand. So do all of us." He smiled toward the anniversary displays spread across the fellowship hall. "We're preserving the ministry's history can properly document. Technically honest, emotionally incomplete." Near the end of the meeting, one volunteer accidentally dropped a large presentation portfolio onto the floor. Photographs scattered across the room. I bent to help collect them. One image immediately caught my attention. It showed Margaret standing beside several church volunteers, packaging peach cobblers into plain paper boxes. The date beneath the photograph quietly stopped me. It had been taken nearly 3 years before the church officially documented the beginning of the hospitality circle. The ministry everyone believed had started through the church pantry had quietly begun through Margaret herself. Driving home, I realized the missing authorization file and the rewritten peach cobbler recipe belonged to the same documentary chain. They had always belonged together. Just before sunset, Sarah stopped by carrying a folded display board she had discovered while helping organize harvest dinner exhibits. "I thought Mom would have wanted you to see this." The display wasn't finished. Across the bottom, Margaret had handwritten only 6 words. "Final authorization attached before celebration." Attached, not filed, not archived. Attached. The missing authorization had never been intended to remain inside Church Heritage File C18. It had traveled with the original harvest dinner presentation package. Somewhere before the celebration, that presentation package still had to exist. And unless I found it in time, The quiet compassion hidden inside one rewritten peach cobbler recipe could disappear beneath one perfectly reasonable administrative decision. I placed the unfinished harvest dinner presentation board beside Margaret's hospitality ledger. For the first time since Sarah returned the recipe box, I stopped thinking about the rewritten peach cobbler recipe itself. The real mystery had never been the handwriting. It was the documentary chain connecting every family Margaret had quietly fed without ever allowing them to feel like charity. During 28 years serving as a Marine Corps supply chief, I learned one lesson every experienced logistics officer eventually accepted. One missing authorization rarely erased the truth. It simply delayed the moment when every remaining document finally confirmed it. The following morning, Grace Holloway called before the church library opened. I found something. The missing authorization? No. Something even better. Within half an hour, I stood beside her inside the oldest archive room beneath the church fellowship hall. Most members never knew the room existed. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, community cookbook drafts, church pantry correspondence, harvest dinner planning files, hospitality journals spanning more than 30 years. Grace unlocked a narrow oak cabinet tucked behind several retired choir hymnals. Across the brass plaque appeared 4 simple words: Hospitality, Heritage Archives. Inside rested carefully wrapped presentation binders from every long-standing church ministry the congregation had quietly preserved. Each binder contained pantry records, volunteer schedules, cookbook drafts, correspondence, planning documents, meal logs, and supporting authorizations. Grace gently lifted one tied with a faded blue ribbon. Across the front, Margaret had written, Hospitality Circle Ministry. My pulse quickened. It was here all along. It had to remain complete. She carefully placed the binder on a long wooden table. Neither of us spoke while I untied the ribbon. Inside rested exactly what every earlier clue had quietly described. The original Hospitality Circle presentation package. Not one document, an entire documentary chain. The original recipe cards, community cookbook drafts, church pantry records, volunteer schedules, hospitality journals, harvest dinner planning files. Every record naturally confirmed the next. Nothing depended upon memory anymore. Nothing depended upon assumptions. Then I reached the page every earlier clue had quietly pointed toward. Final Hospitality Circle Authorization. The authorization explained that Margaret intentionally rewrote her famous peach cobbler recipe during her final months. The rewritten version quietly removed the handwritten initials, identifying families who had privately received meals through the hospitality circle. Only after every family connected with the ministry had regained stability would the original recipe return to the Hughes family recipe box. The recipe had never been changed. It had been protecting dignity. Track A quietly became Track B. The rewritten recipe, the missing initials, the cookbook archives, the hospitality journals, the pantry records, the harvest dinner planning files. Every clue now formed one complete documentary chain. Nothing relied upon opinions anymore. Nothing relied upon incomplete memories. Then Grace quietly handed me one final sealed envelope. The church elders asked me to wait until today. Across the front, Margaret had written only one sentence. Open only after every table is remembered. I carefully unfolded the letter. Walter, if you're reading this then the recipe has finally come home. Never remember it only as my peach cobbler. Remember it as the invitation we quietly carried to families who needed hope more than dessert. If a single recipe could help someone believe they still belonged at the table, then our kitchen continued serving long after I was gone. Love always tastes better when no one has to feel ashamed for receiving it. For several long moments, I couldn't continue reading. Grace quietly looked toward the stained glass window.
I never wanted you to believe Sarah had changed Margaret's recipe. I know. We simply couldn't explain everything until every record belonged together again. Technically complete, emotionally true. That afternoon, I attended the final harvest dinner planning meeting before the celebration. Harold Benson greeted me with the same confident smile. I'm glad everything finally makes sense. So am I. He believed the missing authorization had disappeared years earlier. He believed the hospitality circle would quietly disappear with it. I thanked everyone politely, returned every document to the presentation package, and left without revealing what I had found. For the first time since Sarah placed the recipe box in my hands, I willingly allowed everyone to believe the rewritten peach cobbler recipe had simply been copied to preserve fading ink. Only Margaret had understood years before. Sometimes the greatest family recipe was never meant to preserve food. It was meant to preserve another family's dignity until the right moment finally arrived. The church fellowship hall filled long before the annual harvest dinner officially began. Families greeted old friends. Children carried baskets of fresh bread. Volunteers quietly arranged homemade pies and casseroles across long serving tables. Photographs celebrating decades of church life lined the entrance walls. Everything looked exactly the way a harvest dinner should. Except for one thing. The future of Margaret's hospitality circle still depended upon one rewritten recipe card. Harold Benson stood confidently beside the anniversary display reviewing the evening program, church history, mission outreach, food pantry milestones. Everything appeared professionally organized. Everything appeared worthy of celebration. Until he reached the final announcement. Beginning tonight, the permanent heritage display will recognize only officially documented church ministries. Informal hospitality traditions will be respectfully archived. Technically reasonable, emotionally incomplete. The senior pastor looked across the fellowship hall. Before we begin tonight's celebration, does anyone wish to share something? I quietly stood, not dramatically, not hurriedly, just calmly enough that every conversation slowly faded away. I do. Harold smiled politely. I thought you might. He believed the missing authorization had disappeared years earlier. He believed no complete documentary chain still existed. I carried the weathered hospitality circle presentation package to the front display table, then removed only one document, the original hospitality circle authorization. My wife established this ministry under an officially recognized church hospitality agreement. Harold nodded respectfully. One authorization alone doesn't establish a permanent ministry. You're right. I smiled gently. That's why it isn't the only document. One by one, I placed every record across the table. The original grease-stained recipe card, the rewritten recipe, the community cookbook drafts, the harvest dinner menus, the hospitality journals, church pantry records, volunteer schedules, county fair entries,
planning documents. Every record naturally confirmed the next. No speeches, only evidence. Harold offered one final objection. The supporting authorization was never archived. No. I quietly opened the final presentation folder. It wasn't archived. It remained inside the original Hospitality Circle presentation package, exactly where Margaret instructed it should remain. The final Hospitality Circle authorization rested before everyone inside the fellowship hall. Every signature remained intact. Church elders, pantry coordinators, cookbook committee members, volunteer leaders, and Margaret Hughes. The room became completely silent. Harold stared at the authorization for several long moments. "I've never seen this," the senior pastor answered before I could. "It has always existed. It simply was never intended to be separated from the complete presentation package." Technically true, emotionally decisive. Harold slowly lowered his eyes. The confidence that had carried him through months of planning quietly disappeared. No dramatic confession followed. None was necessary. The documentary chain had already answered every important question. The church secretary carefully reviewed every page, then compared the authorization with the pantry records, hospitality journals, cookbook archives, harvest dinner files, county fair records, and volunteer schedules. Finally, she closed the binder. The Hospitality Circle was an officially recognized ministry. It will become a permanent part of our church's heritage, beginning tonight. Silence filled the fellowship hall. Then applause slowly spread throughout the room. Not for me, not for the paperwork. For one woman who quietly made certain no family ever felt forgotten simply because they could not fill their own table. Sarah slowly walked toward me, carrying the original peach cobbler recipe. "I wanted to tell you." "I know, but Mom made me promise." And she was right. She gently placed the faded recipe card into my hand. It no longer felt like something that had been altered. It felt like something that had faithfully completed its purpose. Then Grace quietly placed a fresh peach cobbler onto the serving table. Beside it rested a small handwritten card, not with family initials, not with hidden names, only 6 simple words. There is always room for one more. For the first time since Sarah returned the recipe box, I finally understood why Margaret's famous peach cobbler recipe had been rewritten. It had never been hiding ingredients. It had quietly protected the dignity of every family she loved until their story no longer needed protecting. The morning after the harvest dinner, I carried the family recipe box back to the kitchen before sunrise, not because I was still searching for answers, because some recipes deserved one quiet morning after they had finally told their story. Sarah arrived just as the coffee finished brewing. Neither of us spoke right away. Words had already done their work the night before. Morning sunlight settled gently across the old wooden recipe box. For the first time since Margaret passed away, it no longer felt incomplete. Grace Holloway joined us a few minutes later carrying one small oak keepsake box. "I think Margaret wanted you to receive this only after everything else." Inside there were no recipe cards, no ribbons, no church certificates, only one faded photograph, one handwritten letter, and dozens of folded thank you notes tied together with the familiar blue ribbon. The photograph showed Margaret standing beside several families outside the church fellowship hall. No one posed, no one looked toward the camera. Children carried peach cobblers wrapped in plain brown paper, while parents quietly smiled through grateful tears. I untied the bundle of letters. One mother had written, "You brought dessert when we thought we had nothing left to place on our table." Another family wrote, "You never made us feel like we were receiving charity. You simply made us feel remembered." Near the bottom rested one sealed envelope addressed to me. I unfolded Margaret's final letter. "Walter, if you are reading this, then the peach cobbler recipe has finally come home." I paused. The original grease-stained recipe rested quietly beside the letter. Then I continued reading. "Please don't remember it only as the dessert everyone loved. Remember it as the invitation that quietly carried people back to hope. Every handwritten initial belonged to a family that needed kindness more than attention. When Sarah copied the recipe, she wasn't protecting my handwriting. She was protecting their dignity until they no longer needed our silence." If one simple recipe helped someone believe they still belonged around God's table, then our kitchen never truly stopped serving others. For several long moments, I couldn't continue reading. Sarah quietly reached across the table and held my hand. "I almost told you." "I know. But Mom said the documents had to tell the story first." She knew me better than anyone. Together, we opened the oak keepsake box one last time. Inside its lid, Margaret had written only 6 words. "Every table has room for hope." Several weeks later, the hospitality circle became a permanent part of the church's history. The original peach cobbler recipe returned to our family recipe box. Its story belonged to everyone. Every harvest dinner, volunteers still bake one extra peach cobbler. No family knows exactly who prepared it. They simply know there is always enough to share.
If this story reminded you that the greatest family traditions are often the quiet ones that restore another person's dignity, thank you for sharing this journey. May your table always welcome one more chair. May your kindness nourish hearts long after the meal has ended. And may every act of quiet generosity become part of someone else's lasting hope.